there, Christian. Welcome back.
Thank you, James. Always a pleasure. Good to be here.
Well, thanks again. So this is episode 3 of our podcast series, and this episode is titled Collaboration Barriers or Opportunities in the NGO World. So I'm going to go straight in and start talking about where these barriers or opportunities exist. So, starting with that, one of your goals in the NGO world has been to establish reporting conduits between NGOs and from NGOs to law enforcement. What was the biggest barrier you've encountered in building that trust, and what also is those opportunities you have discovered when fostering that collaboration, through that process?
I mean, the barriers there are multiple, quite frankly. There's always going to be a barrier between civil society and law enforcement, regardless of how those relationships might work, formally or informally, because law enforcement usually are agencies with executive powers. They have access to a lot more different information than NGOs do. But nonetheless, I think it comes down to potential risk versus reward from the perspective of the NGOs and the law enforcement agencies. So NGOs are very protective of the sources of their information, for example, for their data that they gather, whether that's through academic research, and also law enforcement agencies are sometimes quite suspicious, I suppose, or reticent to work with civil society or NGOs, given that lots of NGOs come across publicly as fairly activist. Some of them might be seen to be sort of anti-government or anti-state or anti-authoritarian. So there's a bit of a sort of brusque relationship potentially between the two. But what we discovered working with various law enforcement agencies at local, regional, and national levels is that by NGOs acting as a sort of trusted third party, they can act as almost as a hub. So we can receive sensitive information from a wide variety of sources. So individuals on the ground, human intelligence. We have the capability to evaluate it, to analyse it, to sanitise it, and then to share that with law enforcement. And I think once law enforcement agencies understand that exists a level of competence, professionalism, and understanding of their intelligence requirements, then that builds trust, it builds rapport, and it builds confidence. So neither organisation are exposing too much to one another, but there is a decent conduit, a decent flow of information, and with that, both organisations get a sort of slightly bigger global perspective of the operational picture. It can be complex, but it can be done.
Okay, thanks for that. And in your roles within Interpol and working, with the Met Police at Scotland Yard, how would you say to bridge that gap between NGOs and law enforcement and also the academic bodies? What's that from your perspective is that most common misconception that these groups have about one another that can hinder those partnerships? And then I suppose lastly, how do you overcome that? How do you overcome those challenges?
Yeah, I think between those three sort of broad entities, there's often a misconception amongst them of one another's objectives, for example. And certainly my experience has been in relation to sort of timeliness or timelines. So, for example, law enforcement objectives are often sort of mission critical, so they need to be dealt with fairly quickly. Intelligence flows need to be swift, and there needs to be quite a significant amount of reactivity. That's definitely not the case, for example, in academia, where they conduct very, very in-depth, thorough, scientific, causal research to understand, for example, people's behaviours or people's motivations, and they come out with some really good product. But that product is has often been constructed and created whereby it's too late to be of any utility for law enforcement, for example. And again, this is a position where NGOs and NGO intelligence take a prime role. To be honest with you, again, it's like acting as I suppose, a translator between the two worlds. So we can repackage NGO findings into evidential briefs that law enforcement can act on. Alternatively, we can package data or information into parcels for use by academia. We can translate academic findings into something that's useful for law enforcement, and so we bridge the gap between the two. I think a key is between academia and law enforcement is trying to make them understand that whilst their objectives might be different, the work that they're doing in the long term is absolutely not contradictory. It's aiming to understand criminality, how criminals behave, and identify specific or appropriate points of intervention, which, as we know, don't necessarily need to be criminal justice interventions. They can be, behaviour change programs or sort of community outreach projects or whatever it might be. And it's all about making both parties understand or showing both parties that these approaches are absolutely complementary and that they can ultimately be coordinated. I think that academia have traditionally been dismissive of law enforcement, and law enforcement have traditionally been dismissive of academia. And I have found definitely that there are points of juxtaposition for both where there is great usefulness in both of them understanding each other's objectives and working together to achieve ultimately what is a common goal.
Right, lovely. Yeah, no, thanks for that. And I suppose moving on from that question of talking about common goals, you've worked in a lot of collaborative forums, coalitions, consortia. And in that experience, once you form these larger coalitions, is that fostering collaboration, or is it creating a bigger beast that moves around? There's competition for funding, and there's also everybody's trying to be recognized for their work, but some of the smaller players miss out or lose out on funding or recognition. What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, the reality is that is the case, regardless of how many people extol the virtues of various consortia or fora or whatever it might be. There are often initiatives to create new ones, to create new partnerships or collaborations. The reality is all of these partnerships already exist in some form or other. And yes, they do become sort of onerous, lumbering, bureaucratic beasts, which is great for, I suppose, for branding and raising awareness amongst the wider community, I suppose. But in relation to action and impact, it's quite rare to see such organisations or groups have a definitive, powerful impact. Yes, they become very focused on fundraising. They become very focused on obtaining media attention, or from a social media perspective, followers or engagement or likes or whatever it might be. But there are opportunities to use these forums for the greater good, and a lot of that is around setting common standards. So I've worked with many organisations where we've attempted to create, for example, fundamental basic standards for conducting investigations in particular circumstances. So establishing basic investigative protocols, stuff that you or I might take for granted. So understanding basic evidential integrity or forensic integrity at a crime scene, for example. There are organisations that I've been involved with who've set these very fundamental standards, and that's where the utility of those organisations come in. There are opportunities that we miss with these collaborations, and that's very specifically around information and intelligence sharing, and enhancing the progress of an investigation, for example. This is where probably a third party would be very useful. So an independent or impartial third party like NGO Intelligence could become involved and act as a sort of hub or repository, and effectively guide or cajole maybe investigative pistes or intelligence leads, and try and engage some sort of advancing progress, because very often with the intention of sharing information, these forums or consortia, exactly as you say, become sort of mouthpieces for self-aggrandizement or self-praise for those particular organisations who are involved, and that really doesn't render anything useful for anybody. So rather than being, a talking shop, there is ultimately some tangible and visible progress or movement in trying to achieve some sort of operational objective, for example. Excuse me.
Okay, thanks for that. And look, you've worked on both sides of the fence from an NGO perspective and from a law enforcement agency perspective. And, you've already mentioned about, formal collaborations have certain limitations, but there's also certain opportunities there. Can you think of a particular time where there's been an unexpected opportunity for an NGO wearing your NGO hat, and conversely, a time where there's been a significant limitation due to that formal collaboration?
Yeah, I think fairly recently, I probably can't go into too many details because the case is still ongoing. But fairly recently, in a Central African country, I was working on behalf of an NGO where we had a formal mandate or a formal agreement with that country's financial intelligence and investigation unit, and that formal mandate basically was around us sharing intelligence with the financial intelligence unit on suspected wildlife traffickers and their associates and their activities, a sort of fairly standard picture. And we did this through standardized protocols. We shared intelligence with this particular FIU. And as a result of some of the information that we shared, the analysts within that FIU, who were extremely competent and incredibly enthusiastic, very, very well trained, they showed our analysts some particular techniques for extrapolating a bit more information out of some of the data that we'd shared. So some really interesting analytical techniques that enabled our analysts to delve a bit deeper into effectively following some financial transactions involving a couple of wildlife traffickers. And it was very useful. It was a significant boon for us as the NGO and for our analysts from a professional perspective. Some great skills were shared and some useful tools were shared. But this took a really long time. And again, it harks back to what I was mentioning earlier about timeliness and investigations or intelligence-led operations being critical from a time perspective. And whilst this process with the financial investigation unit was very, very useful, ultimately, it was super slow. I mean, it was, having the formal agreement in place required formal communications at all times. And you had to go through, various levels of hierarchy to ensure everybody was kept in the loop, and that agreements were made and everything was mandated appropriately. My personal perspective, and I think the best way of doing things, and it's certainly something that we would advocate at NGO Intelligence, is this two-track approach. Sometimes I refer to it as embracing the chaos. That's probably far too informal, but nonetheless, a two-track approach is something I've always advocated for, and effectively that is using the formal route. You would always use the formal route, but also maintain an informal network alongside that. So that the informal network is the one that allows for this rapid, very rapid intelligence sharing, threat assessments, early warning system, that sort of thing. And it works very well alongside the formal network. And this is something that I've experienced many, many times, even back in the day in the Met Police with investigations that had an international angle. We always used the formal approach, which was going through our National Central Bureau for Interpol, but at the same time, directly liaising with those relevant foreign law enforcement agencies. And it works because you have the transparency and auditability of the formal approach. So everybody's in the loop, everyone knows what's going on. You're not trying to usurp anyone's knowledge or cut corners, but at the same time, you are able to get things done because you're also following that secondary formal perspective, and that's definitely the most effective way to do things in my experience.
Okay, great. Thanks for that answer. Going on to the final question, and looking at a bit of an experience last year when we were training a law enforcement agency in Africa, we were working with an NGO. As well, and delivering training to them. We understand we've got these different personalities and different hats are going on in the room, but we're training them in the same subject matter in some intelligence and investigation work on how to gather intelligence out there in the field. So reflecting on your experience of mentoring with various agencies, what do you think is that key difference in that mindset, or those hats that an NGO investigator might wear and a government intelligence officer? And what do you think are those biggest barriers on the collaboration, and where do you see are the greatest opportunities for that complementary partnership?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the biggest barriers that I've experienced between the NGO investigative mindset and governmental or police investigators is this concept of is effectively the concept of sharing and the concept of need to know as well. So a government or police agency is built upon this fairly siloed structure of different units. So it's very compartmentalized. And there's this inherent understanding, usually within most governmental agencies or police agencies, around the protection of sources and sanitising information, that sort of thing. And the NGO world is all about sharing information, which probably comes from the very wide, vast publication of academic papers back in the day, which is how most NGOs started, certainly in the conservation world. But nonetheless, NGOs thrive on this collaboration, partnerships. They've always got partners in the field and elsewhere. So information sharing is important to them to achieve whatever objectives they need to achieve. And that is at odds with the concept of compartmentalization and protecting sources and sanitising information and sharing information with particular individuals only on a need-to-know basis. And so one of the advantages with NGO intelligence is that we understand this and we can bridge that gap. We understand that there are security protocols. We understand that there are, for example, information and source evaluation methodologies and gradings. We understand that reporting and information sharing needs to be sanitized where it's appropriate, and that we understand the concept of need to know. We understand about protecting sources of information. So we're in a position to be able to bridge that gap. And this is something that I've implemented, I don't know, dozens of times within various NGOs that I've worked with, is structuring information sharing processes, building information sharing agreements in an appropriate way so that the security requirements that are required by the government agency, for example, meet the collaborative or cooperative requirements of the NGO. So there's a balance there, and it's really easy to make that balance. But it's all about making each side or working with each side so that they come to an understanding of each other's perspectives, their objectives, and their sort of standard processes that are needed. Whilst at the same time, of course, the critical thing in information sharing is that safety, security, and source protection angle, and that is, quite frankly, early on in my NGO career, that was something that absolutely was not considered at all. And luckily, that's a process that organisations are beginning to understand now. But yes, like all of these things, it's a balancing act. Just being in a position to be able to satisfy the needs of one whilst meeting the needs of the other. And that's a role that organisations like NGO Intelligence can perform with a significant amount of knowledge, experience, and professionalism.
Excellent, thanks. So, look, I know we've covered quite a lot there, and I think there's some key takeaways from what we've discussed today, and the points that I've picked up are, it's around an understanding and a level of communication between the parties. At times I think, and you've mentioned this, there can be a clash of mission or values between what the police or law enforcement is doing and what the NGO is doing. And that comes around sometimes by a misconception. And if there's a better understanding, about what that NGO does or how the police operates, a lot of those issues can be dealt with, and therefore communication is key. I suppose that leads on to the next point, is a really interesting point here. And I think this will help a lot of NGOs and also law enforcement understand it better, is having these formal and informal relationships. We've got a formal relationship. This is how we operate, but we've built personal relationships with those people within the organisation. We know that, say, for Christian is the person to go to because he's got an experience in managing informants. He might not be involved in what we're doing here within this training or within this project, but we know he's a great source for us to go and have a chat with, to help understand where some of the challenges are.
Yep.
And I think the third point is about managing these collaborations. Collaborations need to be managed. Managing that, what we call stakeholder engagement, and having a framework that everybody operates to, or a set of standards. Common reporting system, or we've got a common standards, or we've got a framework, so we all understand that if we're going out to obtain some digital evidence, this is our procedures that we run. If we're managing an informant, this is how we do it. We don't share who that source is, but we can share the sanitized intel. So I think the overall picture here is around keys, communication frameworks, and relationship. I think that brings us to the end of those questions. Is there anything else you want to add on to this, Christian, before we close it for today?
No, I would say that, both of us have used the terms collaboration and cooperation fairly extensively during this particular session, and that's something really to bear it. That needs to be the fundamental basis of both formal and informal working amongst NGOs, academia, and law enforcement. It is all about the collaboration, and collaboration is a two-way street. And sometimes that's, I think, lost in the message or lost in translation, i.e. all parties have got a role to play to make that relationship work. That's an important thing to note, I think.
Perfect. Thanks so much for that. So the next podcast, episode 4, is going to be on one of the critical topics that we NGOs always have, is those funding challenges. And it's how do we get our donors, how do we get those sponsors, to show us the money and support, and also how do they want that money deployed? So we'll welcome you back for episode 4 on Show Me the Money. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you very much. Cheers, James.
Okay. Take care. Thank you.